little bit today. Okay, so let's start with some fun. The way we do when we, whoopsie, lots going on. One more try. Okay, let's start with some fun. I think some people's, maybe their mics are on. So if your mic is on and you can work on that, that would be great for me. Okay, so I want to start the way we do when we start units in science. And ask you to write something in the chat about what you notice or what you wonder from looking at these pictures. Plants can be everywhere. Roots, growth can happen everywhere. Plants are growing. Life finds a way. How can these plants grow in these different places? What allows these plants to grow in these unique locations? Plants seem to be growing where there's no soil. So how is that possible? How'd they get there? What does the weather have to do with these plants? It's super surprising, the places that these plants are growing. How are they growing without soil? That's a big question, right? Any hydroponic gardeners around out there might be able to talk a little bit about that. Okay. Just looking to see what else people wonder. All of these places look wet. Does that have something to do with the plants growing? These plants seem to be thriving in very different environments. Anything else you wonder when you look at these pictures? Some of these maybe seem like kind of harsh environments or weird spots for the plant to grow. Like maybe the one that's growing through the blacktop on the bottom left of the screen, or the one that's growing on a tiny little rock surrounded by water, or the one growing out of a rooftop on a clock tower. Right? Okay, so when we start doing a science unit with kids, we always start with what we call puzzling phenomena. And these are puzzling phenomena, right? Something puzzling, something that can make kids really curious, something that will make kids wonder, something that will make kids want to engage in investigations and figure out what is going on here. We're really interested in kids wanting to make sense of the world. The science educators I work with talk about sense making a lot, and using science practices to figure out what is going on. So I share this with you, even though we're talking about writing specifically, just to give you a sense of how interesting and how exciting it can be for kids to engage in trying to understand a science phenomena, to understand a science question. And what I'm going to argue today is that literacy, right, reading, writing, speaking, listening, is of course going to be a huge part of engaging in this kind of sense making and supporting kids' understanding of how the world around them works. And I'm going to focus in on writing, but I am also going to talk about other aspects of literacy a little bit as well, because how can we not when we're investigating such interesting things? Okay. So young children are curious about the world around them. There's evidence from research that they are capable of scientific reasoning even before kindergarten. We know that science supports students' literacy development. For example, the more you know about a topic of a text, particularly a text that might call on science knowledge, the better you're going to be at comprehending that text. And we also know that literacy supports students' science sense making, right? Because they have to talk about, read about, write about what it is that they're trying to figure out. The biggest challenge, probably, you all have heard Nell talk about this and me talk about this many times before, is that science is often pushed out of the curriculum to make time for literacy. And not to beat around the bush, there's that underlined line right there. This is really bad for science learning, because if kids don't have science learning, they're not going to do science, right? And bad for literacy learning, because of course, science knowledge supports kids' comprehension, but also, as we're going to talk about today, there's lots of other opportunities for literacy learning that are part of what kids are going to be up to as they're doing science. I just want to say that I am happy to take questions in the chat, but I'm not always monitoring the questions in the chat. So I'll try to take a peek every little while, but also if anyone wants to get my attention, feel free to do that, and I can stop and answer questions if something comes up. I don't mind. Okay. All right. So there's really two ways to think about literacy and content area learning in general, right? The one is the siloed instruction. So this is where time spent on one subject reduces time spent on another. And you've heard this argument a lot of times. You've probably heard it in the media. You've heard it in our policies. You've probably heard it, administrators say it in your various institutions, which is we don't have time for science because we need more time for ELA. Our kids aren't learning to read at the pace that we're hoping for, or in the ways that we're hoping for. They're not doing well enough on their M-STEP. And so we have to cut the science to make more time for ELA. Okay, so that is the one view of thinking about literacy and science instruction. And I like to think of that as the glass half empty view. We have to fight for time in our instructional day. A different way to think about it is that more opportunities for science and social studies and math and the arts and physical education and all of the other things that kids need to learn to be whole and functioning human beings in our society actually open up opportunities, more opportunities for language and literacy learning in the elementary grades. So when we talk about our work in Solid Start and we're trying to convince an administrator to try it, we actually say kids are going to double dip on their literacy. In other words, they're going to learn, do learning to align with literacy standards during their ELA time. And then they're just going to get more opportunities to do that stuff during their science time. So it is not that science reduces opportunities for literacy. In fact, science opens up additional opportunities for kids to engage in some of the practices they're learning in ELA, but also new types of literacy, new things of doing as readers, writers, speakers, and listeners that they might actually not get the opportunity to do if we don't have any science time. And I'm going to talk about both of those today. Okay, so I am going to talk in terms of our project and my work, mostly just because that is what I know best. And that is where I've had the opportunity to think about curriculum design that integrates science, oral language, and literacy since about 2014 when we started working on this. So our Solid Start project originated as a small curriculum study where we were going to try to design sort of proof of concept units to show that you could engage in lots of literacy during science instruction. And over time, it has developed into a full year science curriculum that meets all the science standards for K1 and 2, and also supports many of our ELA standards for K1 and 2. So there's curriculum. It's also developed into supporting coaching and professional learning and tools for coaches and teachers to use to engage in science talk. But the most important thing to say is that it's open access. So anyone who wants to afterwards go to solidstart.msu.edu and download any of these materials, they are for you. I get absolutely nothing if you go use them, other than the joy and pleasure of knowing that hopefully our children are getting some science instruction in their elementary classrooms with lots of wonderful literacy learning opportunities. So check those out if you're interested. we are really seeing that having strong curriculum materials does make science instruction much more doable for our elementary teachers than having to truly figure it out by themselves. It's taken a team of science and literacy educators since 2014. These are people who can work on this and have time in their day for it and think about it and try these units out with teachers and get feedback. It's taken us since 2014 to make all of this. So the idea that we might expect any teacher to just spontaneously develop integrated science and literacy curricula for entire years is just, that's a really big expectation to put on anybody. So having a starting place, which I would say these are, might be a good way to get something going in your various institutions. And teachers don't have to start by doing 4 units the first year. They might pick one and start with that and go from there. Okay. And let me tell you a little bit more about what happens in a solid start unit. And then we'll get a little more into what writing looks like and why we've made those decisions about writing. Oh, that's me saying that our first round of curriculum was way back in 2013, 2014. And we designed and iteratively tested these interdisciplinary units. And we found that kids grew in their science learning and in their literacy learning, and especially oral language vocabulary by engaging in this work. Okay. So one thing that has really influenced a lot of the work that we do, of course, are the next generation science standards. These are our current science standards. They were not even out yet when we started designing Solid Start. In other words, we hadn't adopted them yet. We used them to develop Solid Start. So that's something a little different about our curriculum. Many curricula like sort of retrofit themselves to next generation science standards, but we develop them with these in mind. So what's really interesting about these, for those of you who are literacy educators that might not be reading the NGSS on a Saturday night just for fun, well, they're really organized around these 3 dimensions of science instruction. And what is especially interesting is that the science educators really want these 3 dimensions to be interconnected. So what are the 3 dimensions? These are science and engineering practices. So these are what you do to do science, right? Cross-cutting concepts used across all branches of science. So these are conceptual understandings that might be important in physics, as well as in engineering, as well as in chemistry, right? And then disciplinary core ideas. So these are the ideas specific to the aspect of science kids are learning. So if they're learning physical science, there's particular ideas about physical science they're supposed to learn, or life science that they're supposed to learn. And what they're really interested in doing is having these all be interconnected. So kids are like doing the practices of science and engineering as they're thinking about some of these cross-cutting concepts and learning the particular discipline and unit that they're in. So it's not that you do one of these and skip the rest, like we're doing science process, but we're not learning anything. No, it's all integrated so that they're sort of getting the skills and the knowledge are developing all together. Okay. So when you take a look at the standards, in case anyone hasn't ever looked at them before, this is what you would see. Ooh, not that, but this is what you would see. I'm sorry, I keep kind of peeking at the chat and stuff, and that messes with my screen. Okay, so this, for example, is a first grade. One of the areas that first graders are supposed to study is waves and light. And what you see at the very top, those things that say 1PS41, 1PS42, those are the actual standards, or they call them performance expectations for kids. These are the things kids should be able to do. And the red clarifies exactly what they might be assessed on or not. Okay. And what they did to create these performance expectations at the top is combine the ideas that are in the blue, orange, and green, which are the practices, the core ideas, and the concepts kids are supposed to learn. The other thing you'll notice at the very, very bottom and tiny, and I've cut off the math ones, but they have Common Core state connections. And they have like sort of cherry picked some of our ELA standards to say that kids should be able to do them when they're learning waves, light, and sound. for you all to know, and I tell this to any science educator, I ignore those completely because I think there's way more ELA standards going on than just what's in that little box, the 4 that happen to be picked. But sometimes they are really obvious because, for example, if students are asked to communicate ideas in writing in some way, we're probably writing informational text, right? So in this case, for waves, light, and sound, we want kids to plan and conduct investigations to provide evidence that vibrating materials can make sound and that sound can make materials vibrate. We want kids to make observations to construct an evidence-based account that objects can be seen only when illuminated. So you know how kids think you see because light flies out your eyes. No, there has to be an external light source. So that's what they have to learn. Plan and conduct an investigation to determine the effects of placing objects made with different materials in the path of a beam of light. So they're going to notice things like shadows or mirrors or reflections, right? And use tools and materials to build a device that uses light and sound to solve the problem of communicating over a distance. This is first grade, people. It's awesome that they get to do all of this. But something to notice here is that if you're planning and conducting an investigation, if you're making observations, if you're constructing an argument or an evidence-based account, all of these things are going to be happening in oral. If you're communicating, right, you're going to be using oral and written language, and that's going to be a really important part of what you do. Lots of opportunities that jump into my mind, but hopefully are jumping into yours about how we're going to integrate literacy into this work. So when we see things like share observations, describe patterns, ask questions, construct an argument supported by evidence, right? I go right to, well, we're going to orally share our observations, or we're going to write them down. We're going to write down our descriptions of patterns, or we're going to share them verbally. Same thing with our questions. We need to write them down to keep track of them, right? If we're going to construct an argument, we're going to write down our ideas. So lots of opportunities to align with our ELA standards, particularly around informational text, speaking and listening, particularly informational writing and language. So in Solid Start, what we have made the decision to cover as far as our ELA standards are just what I said, but also we made some decisions about what we don't cover. What we don't do is systematic instruction on foundational skills in Solid Start, and we don't do systematic instruction around literature in Solid Start. Why? Well, scientists hopefully don't go to a novel to look up the information that they're conveying as scientifically accurate information, right? It's not a genre typically used in science. So we really try to take a disciplinary literacy approach and have kids learn the types of literacy that scientists are likely to use. That's our decision. There are other science curricula that do use literature to engage kids in the learning. So we do informational text, we do informational writing. Of course, kids are using their foundational skills to do the reading and writing in Solid Start, right? You can't write if you don't know what letters and sounds, what sounds are in a word and what letters to represent those with. So they're practicing things they're learning in ELA, but we're not actively teaching them. It's not like going to be a time that we learn a letter sound pattern during Solid Start. We might support kids as needed to convey their ideas. So what else are some of the design principles we made a decision about? Well, one is to always start with a puzzling phenomena and a driving question. So just like I did with you, we're interested in kids having the opportunity to get interested in something puzzling in their world and try to figure out using science practices, right? And learning science ideas, how or why that is the case, right? So for example, we might look at images of the dunes at Lake Michigan over time and how they've changed and wonder, how can our Earth change? Look at ants in an ant farm and think about the role that ants play in our environment, or how ants change their environment to get what they need. We might watch a boxcar derby and wonder how we can make boxcars move fast and far. So we always start with kids' curiosity and something exciting that they can make sense of, that's going to engage them through the unit. And then we have lots of opportunities to support students in making sense of this phenomenon. So opportunities for children to ask questions orally and in written language, to engage in explorations. Those might be traditional experiments, but it might be observations of something in the environment. Lots of opportunities for interactive read alouds to learn some information that kids might not be able to explore in their classroom. Writing every day in different forms, and I'm going to show you some of those. And then always opportunities to take all of that learning and synthesize the ideas through discussion to try to make sure that we're keeping track of what it is that kids are learning and what more questions come up. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about all of those. Okay. So for example, we always have a driving question, something like, why can't I read in the dark? That's the unit I'm going to focus on today because it's so fun to do with literacy coaches. So, because it's all about reading too. So the kids ask, why can't I read in the dark? Okay. And that is our unit level question. But then we have daily questions for them to investigate to start to figure out why they can't read in the dark. So things like what happens when we read in bed under the covers? What materials create the best shadows? How can we read under opaque covers? So we have multiple opportunities for the curriculum to pose questions to answer, but then also for kids to add their questions to be answered as they continue to learn more. Because as you can imagine, the more we learn, the more questions come up. We have lots of opportunities for kids to gain and explore, to engage in explorations, so investigations, but also collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data. So you can see the example, right? There's some writing right there in order to collect data. This is a class that was looking at different kinds of ramps that might make a boxcar go fast or slow. And they actually ran their experiment twice, near and far, fast and slow. So they were comparing. We also have children engage in lots of play where they're pretending as a way to understand and to explore with everyday materials. So in the top there, that's a wind flag to see how fast the wind is going that kids created. And the child in the bottom is learning about air by blowing through a straw and moving paper. Clearly, that's a pre-pandemic picture right there because nobody's blowing any air around these days. We try to keep our air inside our masks. But that's from before pandemic. But just to give you a sense, right? So when kids have a question, they're also engaging. And this is the part that people think of the hands-on activities. We try to avoid that term because we're interested in the thinking as well as the physical doing. So sometimes we say brains-on activities. So the kids are learning, right? And they're doing lots of recording, including in science. They're adding to what the information that they can explore through interactive read alouds. So what they're using informational text for is to engage in the science practice of obtaining and evaluating information. So that's actually one of the science practices that are part of the next generation science standards. And the idea is that they're reading to inform their sense making around the phenomenon to answer the question. And the other wonderful thing about interactive read alouds that you've all heard me talk about a lot is it introduces some of the disciplinary language, some of the specific language for the content that they're learning. We do a lot of vocabulary instruction. We do it a little bit differently to the way you might see it for texts in particular. So we really don't try to front load all the vocabulary for a unit. We don't think that that is, some of you heard me talk yesterday about a meaningful context for vocabulary. Well, sticking a bunch of words on a word wall with a definition, and that does not a meaningful context make. So we don't do that. What we do is support kids in learning learning new vocabulary language as they engage in answering their question and as this becomes really important to sharing their ideas. So we learn some new words almost every day as we learn new concepts. Here it is. I'm getting into some of the writing. Okay, so what kind of writing do kids do? Well, definitely scaffolded opportunities to practice emergent writing. So for example, for our kindergartners, they might not do much of their own writing. It may be that the teacher is writing down their ideas. You can see it's on the right of my screen. There's a chart where the teacher has written down what each kid is saying. So to record the ideas. So that's some dictation. Okay. But students also create, on the bottom right, you can see students are drawing and writing to observe. In this case, this is from our weather, a unit on weather on the bottom right. So they're out there observing. We have different opportunities for students to write down their own ideas and their thinking. And we also have models. So that is where students are using pictures, labels to show their thinking. And that's the bottom left right there. So they're showing energy using WikiSticks pictures and some labels. So all of these we consider to be different writing opportunities. And we think of writing really broadly, including images, right? Including graphical representations of ideas, especially because we're talking about kindergartners, first and second graders who may be able to express through their images what they cannot yet write, because writing is both physically challenging, but also they have to represent all those sounds. So we do a combination of all of images, of writing, of dictation to support kids in sharing their ideas through written language. Okay. And then we always use writing as part of synthesis discussions. So every single lesson that kids get through Solid Start has a discussion that brings together the evidence and information they've gathered from their book readings, from their explorations. And we try to keep, this is just one version of it, but teachers keep a summary table where they say, like, what did we ask today? What did we figure out? And what questions do we have for tomorrow? And sometimes these summary tables may use images, photographs, drawings, written language. But the goal is that there's this track record of the learning and of the ideas and of the idea development over time that creates real cohesion for kids, right? So oftentimes kids experience science learning as a bunch of activities, right? On Monday, we look at rainbows. On Tuesdays, we do volcanoes. On Wednesday, we went outside and observed the weather, right? It's something like that. And it's not a coherent learning experience that builds over time to help them figure out how their world works. So writing is an incredibly powerful tool, right? For keeping track of this learning, for establishing this coherence. And we can always go back to these synthesis charts. Sometimes people call it noticing and wonderings charts. There's a lot of different names for these, clues charts. There's a lot of names for these, but they are really core to what happens in these units and to making kids learning, helping kids build their learning over time. Okay, so I think I already told you when we first piloted this, we saw improved science sense-making outcomes. In other words, kids could make claims and give evidence, improved literacy outcomes like expressive and receptive language, and better and great science talk in the classroom. So that was really exciting. And I think I also told you this. So we've gone on and developed these. And they're about 40 hours of science per year. That's it. I just want you to think about that for a minute, because if we do a 90-minute ELA block, how quickly do you get to 40 hours? That's really fast. That's the first month of school. We're talking 40 hours over the whole year, but we are able to cover our science standards with that and many, many ELA learning opportunities. And let me tell you, I cannot explain to you how hard it is to even get those 40 hours. Science is always the first thing to go. Especially last year with remote instruction, kids were not getting any science at all. So we think that's not a lot to ask. But it also seems like it is a lot to ask because of that siloed model that is so much a part of our schools. Okay. Well, let's talk about how all of this might align with our literacy essentials. So here's essential 6. And here is where I see alignment. And let me talk you through a little bit of that. Daily time for children to write aligned with instructional practice number 1 above. So that's motivation, right? So motivating reasons for kids to write. Well, I think that figuring out a science phenomenon, our kids think this too, or keeping track of what they're figuring out in an investigation or sharing their ideas that they've figured out, it's a pretty motivating reason for them to write. We don't hear a lot of, I don't want to do that about the writing when it's embedded in these kinds of really interesting investigations. Instruction in writing processes and strategies, particularly those involving researching, planning, revising, and editing. So we do have kids write informational text, but also the researching and the planning is a huge way that we can do writing. So for example, when kids are planning their investigations, I'm going to show you some actual physical examples of this in a minute, but when they're keeping track of the research they're doing, in this case, right, their science explorations and what they're figuring out, we have opportunities for engaging kids in writing. Opportunities to study models and write a variety of texts for a variety of purposes and audiences, particularly opinion, informative, explanatory, and narrative. And we focus on informative, explanatory, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the opinion thing in a minute. But the kids do get opportunities to write a variety of texts for a variety of purposes. And I think you already saw some of the examples above. Okay. What I don't spend a lot of time on or don't encourage teachers to in science is explicit instruction in letter formation, spelling, capitalization, punctuation, sentence construction, keyboarding. It's not that they don't edit and revise their work. It's just that they have ELA time to learn these explicitly. And then this is an opportunity to apply that information. So I actually really try to ask the teachers doing Solid Start not to make the kids spell all of the science words correctly or just copy down what's on the board, but rather to encourage them to use writing to express their ideas and their thoughts, even if they're not with perfect letter formation or spelling. So we're really thinking about purposeful writing here. Okay. Now I'm going to switch gears and show you some findings from a study that I did where we looked at the next generation science standards and we tried to understand what the science standards were saying about literacy instruction that might happen in science. And I'm switching gears to show you more opportunities for writing above and beyond what are in our ELA standards, the literacy essentials. So not an ELA perspective, but a science perspective on literacy. And I see some of these words that I've pointed out before, like construct an argument, communicate solutions, read text and use media, describe patterns, construct an evidence-based account, develop a model to represent, ask questions, gather information. So some of these align pretty well with our literacy standards and some of them don't. For example, construct an argument or construct an evidence-based account actually is a kind of writing that kids are asked to do in science in elementary, but it's not a kind of writing that's in our ELA standards. In ELA, they're asked to give an opinion, but never to engage in an argument from evidence, right? So that's an additional kind of writing or a kind of thinking and writing that is in the science standards that kids would never get to do if we only followed our ELA standards. Okay, it's really important because actually it's something really critical for them to learn to do and start to engage in. We don't see that in our ELA, in our Common Core standards until middle school. So remember I said science is a great opportunity to practice what they learn in ELA, but also to add on literacies, disciplinary literacies that are expected for young children that they otherwise wouldn't get. Here's another one. Develop a model to represent. So when scientists think of models, they think of physical models, like a physical representation, right? Maybe, for example, we might make a blown up model of something really tiny, like of an eyeball to see the parts of it, or make something really large, like outer space, smaller, so we could understand it, right? But it also might show how something work or a process. Like you saw the model kids made of energy moving through a system a bunch of pages ago, and I'll show you some more models in a minute. So it's a way that kids can use writing, drawing, but also physical representations, right? To show ideas, to show thinking. So yes, we do sometimes have things like label a graphic in our informational texts in literacy, but this is really a different kind of way of using representations, right? Using representations to explain ideas that doesn't really, we might not really get to it, right? Like that's not just like labeling the parts of a plant in an informational text. This is really the idea that an image can share an explanation or can share how something works or can share ideas about how the world works. So that's another kind of literacy that kids maybe wouldn't get if we didn't have them do it in science. So I could go on and on about this, but I just want to show you that there are expectations for kids to start to understand the ways that scientists use literacy practices that are somewhat different, or we might never get to if we skip this and only do ELA. Okay, so what do lessons look like? Just to give you a sense, these are the first 3 lessons in a unit called How Can I Read Under the Covers When It's Dark? It's actually called Reading Under Cover is the unit, but our question is, how can I read under the covers when it's dark? And kids are learning about light and light rays as part of this unit. We present it this way so that you can see, right, what's the question of a given day? What are kids, what happens in the lesson? What do kids learn? And how does that lead to the next question, right? So you can kind of see the arrows are showing that. So for example, in the first lesson, the kids think about what happens when we try to read in bed under the covers. And a super fun thing they get to do is build forts in their classroom under all different kinds of materials and try to read a book under there and see what happens. And think about how different, depending on the fabric they're trying to read under, they might get more light or different light with which to see their book. Okay, and then they start to think about, well, what if they bring in a light source and shine a light on different kinds of objects? What happens then? How can we create a model? That's those representations again about the ways that light interacts with different objects. So again, we're using images and words to show a process, right? To show thinking. So that's a literacy, a straight literacy learning opportunity right there. Okay, so this is how it kind of goes on through the unit. Okay, well, what does that look like in a classroom? Well, there's what you can see here is a sheet, and you can see all the lights off in the classroom, and the kids are about to climb under that sheet to try to figure out if they can read their books. Here's a little reading under covers. See what it looks like, or can you read and how so? Okay, and right away, kids get involved in drawing and writing about what it is that happens when they engage in those explorations. So in this case, we have a child who's drawn a picture of themselves reading under a sheet, and it says sheet, and it says thin blanket, and then we have a thick blanket, and it says I can't read, a shower curtain that is clear, I can read. Okay, a thin blanket, I can read. The shower curtain, I can read. The thick blanket says I can't read. Okay, so we can see that the kids, this is just at the beginning, and they revise this over time, but they're starting to share their ideas through drawing and written language. Another way that kids get to engage in writing is to keep track of their data. So for example, in one of the lessons, they create a table where they take a flashlight and shine lights through all different kinds of stuff they find in their classroom. And really it is all sorts of stuff. I mean, sometimes what we tell the teachers to do is bring a few things, bring a little tin foil, because we know that will reflect. Make sure you have some saran wrap because it's see-through, but really they take flashlights and they shine it through anything. And what they do in this is they write the object in the first, they set it up first, they write the object in the first column, and then they write a lot, some, none, light. And they create their own data tables, and then they write down what happens when you shine light on different objects. What have you figured out from your data? Okay, so again, using writing to collect information, but also using writing for kids to share their thinking and what they're figuring out and their sense making. Okay, we're about halfway through the unit, and now we see kids having much more advanced models to show their thinking. This child wrote light rays go straight, and what you can see is they're showing what happens when a light source hits different types of objects: transparent, translucent, opaque, so no light is going through, and you see a shadow, SHADOE, love it, and a mirror. You can see what's happening, and their child is using the arrows to depict the different ways that light is moving. So that's a really wonderful example of what written models might look like in a science classroom. Okay. And the kids in this unit happen to use all of that information. Ultimately, they're told that the reason they're figuring this out is to help their friends, I can't remember if it's help younger friends or whatever, who have to figure out how to read in the dark at night. They really want to read a book and they're not supposed to. They're supposed to go to bed, so they have to figure it out. So they write informational text about what they learned. And this child has drawn an image, and it says dark, complete darkness. And it says dark is when you see light. Darkness is when you see light and dark. Darkness is when you see nothing at all. Dark is when you see some light source. Complete darkness is when you see no light source at all. So it's this differentiation between it just being dark, like in your room at night, where maybe you could still see a little bit because something's coming in the window, and complete darkness. When the light rays hit opaque objects, it doesn't go through. It actually makes a shadow. And there we see a nice model of the light source hitting the opaque object and making the shadow. So this is part of a child's informational text that they write at the end of the unit. And just drawing on what Dr. Nell Duke was saying yesterday, of course, we want kids, when they're doing their informational writing, to know what success looks like. Essential 1, right? We want kids to be successful writers. We got to tell them what that means. So our kids do a plan for their informational texts, and then they have a checklist for themselves to figure out if they talked about different things they were supposed to talk about. And also if they have some of the text features they're supposed to have in that type of informational text. Okay. So what does this all do for kids and their learning, other than that they get lots of opportunities to write, which hopefully has come across if I haven't emphasized that enough. Lots and lots of opportunities to write in science. Well, one of the things we try to do at the end of the unit is we interview kids, and this isn't written language, but they are kindergartners, first and second graders. So at this point, we typically assume they can tell us more than they can write, but if they are learning the ideas, that's all going to come together as their writing fluency grows. So what do we say to kids? We say, well, 2 kids are having a debate about what the best way is to read at night in their room. Jasmine thinks she should read under a thin sheet, and Darius thinks that you should read with a flashlight light. Who do you agree with and why? Okay. This is just an example of the kind of things. Okay, well, all the kids agree with Darius by the end of the unit, thank goodness. Even though they will tell us that the thin sheet will work fine during the day, you could definitely read under it, but at night they need a flashlight. But this is the kind of thing we hear. And I'm pointing this out because when I said engage in an argument from evidence, that's what's going on, right? They're agreeing with someone and giving evidence for why. So Darius with his flashlight, because you can use a flashlight to see better. And if your friend holds the flashlight, then they can both read at the same time. I learned in science that a flashlight is better than this, ... points to the sheet, because a flashlight has light and this one doesn't. It blocks. So if you're reading under a thick blanket, you can't see the words. And if you turn off the light, you can't see. It'd be too dark and you can't even see the page. But if you use a flashlight and you're under a thick blanket, you could see everything, all the words and the pictures. Okay, so that's a first grader. Sharing what they learned, why they agree or disagree, but also giving lots of evidence from the experiences that they've had in science to clearly share why they believe this, right? Which is what we want. We don't just want them to say, because I think, I mean, at the beginning, if we ask them things, they say, because I think so, because my mom told me, because my friend said it was that way. We get all sorts of interesting things like that. But by the end, what we get is a sort of scientific explanation that aligns with the kinds of evidence that scientists might give. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with a couple of quotes to be encouraging, hopefully. These are some of my favorite quotes from a document called A Framework for K-12 Science Education. So this is the sort of a bunch of scholars got together who are science educators and wrote an entire book that turned out to be the basis for NGSS, all about, a vision for what science education should look like. And they did this in 2012, and then they based the standards on this. So what I love about this is coming from the science community, not from literacy educators or the literacy community. And here's what they say. They say an education in science and engineering needs to develop students' ability to read and produce domain-specific text. As such, every science or engineering lesson is in part a language lesson, particularly reading and producing, that's writing, the genres of text that are intrinsic to science and engineering. Okay, so this is really suggesting that even with our youngest learners, this should be part of every science lesson. So what does that mean to me? That means that we're not just doing like wow, look at this random science activity, like let's play with crystals today. What we're doing is building ideas and using reading and writing as part of the figuring stuff out over time in a coherent way for children. Okay, here's my other favorite one. Communicating in written or spoken form is another fundamental practice of science. It requires scientists to describe observations precisely, clarify their thinking, and justify their arguments. So if those are our goals for kids, you know me, I always think we've got to start right from the beginning. If we know where we want to get them, we want to build that in a developmentally appropriate way, starting with our youngest learners. So we're not suddenly in middle school asking them to do things that they've never heard of or seen before, which is often what happens with science, and including the kinds of literacies that kids have to do in science. So we can definitely start by building wonderful opportunities. Well, really in the early childhood years, but for sure when they start to do this work in kindergarten. So important ideas for today, and then I'm going to look in the chat for questions. Okay. Have science instructions. No, have science instruction. Just another typo I'm going to have to fix for you all. I have to tell you, I was reading over my slides right before to make sure there were no typos right before this, and my entire internet went out and I had a giant panic and had to restart my modem 4 times. So I will fix that, but have science instruction, preferably lots of science instruction. If we don't have it, kids are limited in their opportunities to engage in these language and literacy opportunities that really are supposed to be a part of their science and their literacy education. Look for opportunities for children to practice writing skills that they learn in ELA. So, of course we need times for kids to learn foundational skills. I would argue science is not the right time for that. We need opportunities for kids to learn about letters and sounds and spelling patterns and become, fluent at handwriting and all of the things that we need for them to become writers. But this science provides a wonderful opportunity for them to practice all of that in a meaningful way, doing the kind of writing that is engaging and hopefully motivating. And then science opens up these opportunities for additional science-specific writing. So things like constructing a model, starting to construct an argument, right? These are new things. These are things we don't get otherwise. But they are things that kids are supposed to get in K-5, at least according to the science standards. So if we're skipping this, then they're not learning these, they're not getting initial experiences with these science literacies that are going to be important for their long-term science learning. Also, by the way, I'm just going to say, also kids think it's awesome. They really, once they start engaging in this kind of work, they ask every day when science time is going to be. They're into it. So, I mean, which of course is not surprising, right? Who wouldn't want to build forts in their class with flashlights, or go look at ants, or build your own dunes out of sand and spray water all over them, or pre-pandemic blow sand through a straw. Or now we use a fan to blow it. So all of these things are really fun, and kids get to figure out the world. So we should let them have these opportunities. And that is all I have. I'm going to stop sharing and look at questions so I can see something's been going on in the chat. But feel free to add new ones.
Thank you, Tanya. I know that you were thinking we've seen all of this, but really it's a wonderful refresher. And there are some new pieces, and I think we're in a different place now as we think about this context. And so I always take several things new every time.
Yeah, well, the examples are definitely new. I haven't shown this before. I think I did a thing on boxcars the last time, and not on reading undercover. But the nice thing about reading undercover is we have first graders doing a ton of writing. I have a huge box in my office of all the kids who are working. We are working with a couple of schools right now where mostly it is children who are multilingual learners. So children who families at home are not speaking English in most cases. And we're doing Solid Start in that community right now. And it's just so much fun to see what the kids can do, and to be back in schools, because last year we couldn't really be. So every day we get to hear what the kids are saying, and we get we get to see their work, and we get to see the recordings and the teachers video their lessons, so we can watch those. So it's just so fun to be back in school and see kids doing all this stuff. Okay. Some folks are saying if they're work groups, they want to be part of it. That definitely, you can certainly contact us, but also go on solidstart.msu.edu and just, check it out. My recommendation, if teachers are going to start doing this, is that they don't go it alone. It's not that you can't get in there and do it by yourself from the materials. And we've definitely had teachers excited to do that, but it for sure works better if it's group working together and supporting each other, because this can feel very different, particularly different to some of the other science curricula that are out there, but also different to, let's just read some books about science, because we're not really doing that either. We're trying to make sure that kids are engaging in all the science practices, not just gathering information from texts, which is just one of many science practices that kids are expected to be able to do. What else can I answer for everybody? I'm not sure if there's questions here. Someone said a class did a disappearing dunes lesson for their Christmas party. Well, that makes me happy, because if it's for a party, that feels really good. Science is a party. So for disappearing dunes, they build their own dunes. They take like a lasagna pan full of sand, and they stack up the sand, and then they do all sorts of fun things with the sand, like pour water on the sand and blow wind on the sand to see what happens. But they also try to build a solution to prevent dune erosion. So, kids kids do all sorts of fun ideas of how to fix that. If you've ever seen like Unifix cubes holding up a dune, that's sometimes what it looks like. Because why not? It's just a second grade seawall made of Unifix cubes. Okay, well, that's what I have for all of you today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I get so excited talking about this, especially looking at the kids' work and hearing what they have to say. That is what makes it all the work so special. If you have teachers who are interested or questions, you can always contact. You have my email, or there's other contact information on the solidstart.msu.edu.
Thank you, Tanya. And yes, I feel like you could feel joy looking at what the kids were drawing and writing, and just see how they're drawing, and they are engaged, and they're like racing to have like the right detail in there. And so it's a great example, I think. And I'll be honest, when I taught first grade, I was not taught much science as a child, and it was so intimidating to me. I would spend hours kind of combing over everything and trying to make everything, we didn't have Solid Start at the time when I was teaching first grade so long ago, but everything is so focused and organized in your units. So if you haven't looked at the materials that Solid Start has to offer, they're amazing.
I'm going to show, just because we have one more second in case, oops.
Yeah.
Hang on. Can I show you all the funniest thing? Okay. So my daughter, who at the time was in like 5th grade, was listening to me talk about the reading under cover unit, and she thought it would be so fun to try. I did show you one picture of her reading under a sheet, but we might need to stop the recording for this, Annie. I'm going to show you an image that makes me look like the worst mother ever, just because why not?